I'm Pastor Dave Chambers, and I want to take a few minutes today to answer another question from God's Word. And I have with me this morning Mike.
Hi, Pastor. My question is I'm wondering why there are so many variations of baptism in the world today, where the Bible pretty much spells it out.
Okay. We do have a lot of different kinds of baptism. There's, of course, we practice immersion after salvation, so we call it believer's baptism. There are churches, a lot of churches that sprinkle babies, some that pour water over people's head, whether it be an infant or an adult. Why that came to be is a pretty complex question. But so let me start by just saying one of the reasons why we practice baptism by immersion. The book of Acts tells us about Philip and a guy from Ethiopia.
Okay.
And the guy from Ethiopia would come to Jerusalem and was going back to Ethiopia. And while he was going back, he was reading the Bible. And Philip came to him, explained to him about Jesus, that Jesus died for our sin. And the Ethiopian looked at Philip and said, "Here is water. What hinders me from being baptized?" And so the Ethiopian, he understood. He had been at Jerusalem. He'd seen baptisms and understood that this confession of Jesus involved baptizing. And so Philip said, "If you believe with all your heart, you may." And the Ethiopian said, "I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God." And so he commanded the chariot to stand still, and both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and he baptized him. And when they came up out of the water. So what we have there is a description of Philip and this Ethiopian walking down into a pool of water, and then walking back up out of a pool of water. We see something similar in the Gospels with John the Baptist baptizing and baptizing Jesus as they went down into the Jordan River. And so one of the reasons we baptize by immersion is the Bible points to this is how they were baptized. They went down into pools of water, rivers of water, and there the baptism took place in the water. And so we don't just pour or sprinkle anything like that. One of the reasons there are a lot of different versions is as things progressed in church history, sometimes it wasn't always easy to find water.
Oh, okay.
And so some of that, I think that there seems to be some hints of early in church history, churches that were pouring, instead of immersing, because water was hard to find. So it's hard to get to a place where you could find a pool of water deep enough. And some of it too is the way people began to understand the Bible. They began to read the Bible instead of looking at the Bible and saying, what it says is what it means. They began to say, I need to look underneath what it says for extra spiritual meanings. And so they began to kind of look between the lines and started finding some hidden meanings or spiritual meanings. And that actually began to affect the way they talked about baptism, so that they saw, for example, in the Old Testament, that they saw circumcision in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, the spiritual meaning of circumcision is baptism. Because little babies were circumcised, we should baptize little babies. And so that kind of began to turn it some, and they began to shape the way that they did baptism.
Thought of that. Okay, that answered that question.
So,
thank you.
While baptism is very, very important, and it, we certainly would say it matters how you've been baptized. It matters if you've been baptized. I do want to say that this is not something that changes whether or not you're saved. And so I mean that two ways. First, you don't get saved by being baptized. Mm-hmm. So baptizing can never take away sin. In fact, 1 Peter chapter 3 says that very specifically, that baptism does not wash away their sin. And also, if you're saved but not baptized, that doesn't mean you're going to lose your salvation. So it doesn't affect your salvation either way. It's important, but it doesn't change whether or not you're saved.